Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the lecture on the piety impulse, the relationship between art and religion, and that's the very last lecture for Unit 5. And when we last left off, we were comparing these two works of art. I just want to point out a little bit that if you look at just some of the basic structure of this canvas, the corner-to-corner diagonals, right? You can see that there's a lot of careful thought as to how things are organized. And this diagonal, to a certain degree, kind of represents the ground, the earth. This is the diagonal that the cave kind of lines up on. And then this diagonal is the diagonal that goes towards heaven, right? And we have this arc from this tree right there that fills in that corner, and that diagonal happens to go right through the heart of St. Francis standing there. So this is a very kind of intellectual and very math-based approach to representing the divine. The divine in this painting is the very geometry, the very math of the structure of the canvas. And that's one way of kind of representing that sort of interaction with the divine, whereas Bernini represents it in a much more kind of visceral and physical kind of sense. So, but that's those are Christian representations of an interaction with a religion, with the divine, and in kind of Christian visualizations of piety. But we have other examples from like where we very started with the ancient Sumerian and ancient Babylonian artwork, and we have a very different kind of comparison here, right? Where in the ancient Sumerian ones, the figures have this very kind of like upward looking and just the eyes always open, always waiting for word from the divine. Whereas in the stele of Hammurabi, as I mentioned earlier, he's significantly smaller than his deity, but since his deity is sitting, he's basically standing facing eye to eye with his God. All right, so we'll move on. Also want to point out that Michelangelo is not the only artist to have really kind of thought about how the act of making art is a form of creation, and how that kind of act of creation in some ways is also a contemplation of at least one aspect of the divine, right? Because one of the main things we think about when we think about God is the creator, right? And so and there are other examples besides this one, but this is a pretty classic one of that sort of thinking about the relationship between the artist and what the artist is trying to depict. But I want to remind everyone, don't forget that there's a lot of art in this world that is religious, but not of Christian iconography. And here we have two beautiful examples, both of them from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And we have a Chinese Buddha, and we have an Indian copper statue of Shiva. And also some of the most beautiful religious art is architecture, right? Or the religious spaces that were made for people to worship, and the religious spaces where people were meant to contemplate the divine. And that doesn't just include churches, includes all kinds of other religious buildings. But another point I want to make is that religiosity doesn't have to be cultural. It can be completely personal and idiosyncratic, right? In this particular case, James Ensor made a painting that was about his religiosity and his alone, not about really anyone else's. He saw himself as being a religious person in a very non-religious time. He saw his religiosity as being in opposition to his time. And he made this painting basically kind of imagining Christ returning to Brussels, in his lifetime, and basically being ignored because no one was there no one was ready to see him. And then one of my last points I want to make about art and religion is that sometimes art is designed, or at least one of the things it does, is it's not only telling us about religiosity, it is creating a religious experience in and of itself. And I think like this view of Rouen Cathedral, like walking through spaces like that, right, and the way that the light moves through it, that in of itself is kind of a religious experience. it's designed to make you think about the heavens. But even sometimes something, just a beautiful work of art and all the intricate, laborious labor of something like this Key Row page from the Book of Kells is also, in a way, not just an expression of religiosity, but a form of inspiration. And then we see that same sort of thing when we're looking at contemporary artists. I think Joseph Beuys might be kind of easily misunderstood as being purely just a jokester, like, or at least a piece like this, where he had himself locked in an apartment in New York City and spent 3 days living in the apartment with a coyote. And it may seem just like a stunt, but for Joseph Beuys, it was an act of kind of like a magical sort of shamanistic activity. And like with James Ensor, just because someone's religiosity is very odd and personal doesn't necessarily mean it's not real. James Turrell was raised um, as a Quaker, and that definitely is part of his kind of like his aesthetic point of view. He makes artwork that's very, very quiet, and these are works of art that are made entirely out of light. Like this type of piece is designed to look like a painting on a wall, but it's actually not a painting on the wall. It's actually a hole in the wall, and then all of the art is in the projection of light in the space behind. But he also makes pieces that are just pure spaces that you can enter, spaces that feel like they're entirely made out of light. And this piece, Breathing Light, I think is a great example of a contemporary work of art that is, pretty similar to Rouen Cathedral in that it's trying to create sort of a religious experience, not necessarily a specific religious experience, not necessarily a Christian or a non-Christian or any kind of denominational sort of experience, but just an experience of wonderment and of the possibility of something else. And I think that alone is, in a way, religious. All right, that's the end of this lecture. I will see you next in Unit 6.